How could you do this? I'm on the phone right now. Can we talk about this later? How could you do this to me? What are you talking about?
What would you do if someone looked you in the eye and said, "I don't care what your ticket says, you don't belong here"? Now imagine hearing those words, not in a crowded street or a heated argument, but in the polished first-class cabin of a commercial airline. Anthony Cole, a respected black CEO, boarded Global Air Flight 762, expecting nothing more than a few hours of quiet before his next meeting. But when a white passenger refused to leave his paid seat, the cabin turned into a stage for something far larger than a seating dispute. The crew's bias, the mounting tension, the humiliation it all built to a moment that would shake not just an airline, but an entire industry. Was this just one woman's arrogance, or the reflection of a system that silently decides who belongs and who does not? And what happens when the man they tried to dismiss is the very shareholder who holds power over their future? Stay with us, because this story is about dignity, justice, and the price of silence. If this message moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss stories that challenge and inspire. Let's begin. The hum of the jet bridge carried into the cabin like a muffled drumbeat as passengers filed onto Global Air Flight 762. The overhead bins creaked open and shut, the metallic clangs punctuated by the clipped voices of flight attendants welcoming travelers aboard. Anthony Cole stood at the front of the first-class cabin, his boarding pass folded neatly between his fingers. He wasn't in a rush. Years of business travel had taught him to be patient, to move at his own pace. But tonight felt different. He had deliberately chosen comfort over power, dark jeans, a simple button-down shirt, a lightweight blazer instead of the custom suits that usually announced his status in any room. He glanced at the seat printed on his ticket, 1A, the front left corner of the aircraft, a seat he had reserved and paid for weeks in advance. It wasn't just about leg room or the privilege of being served first. To Anthony, it represented the calm he needed after a grueling week of negotiations in Boston. He had promised himself this flight to San Francisco would be quiet, a few hours to reset before stepping into another boardroom war. But as he approached row 1, the quiet he sought dissolved instantly. A woman was already seated in 1A. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, catching the glow of the overhead light. Draped across the seat back was a silk scarf the color of champagne, its designer logo unmistakable. A Chanel handbag claimed the armrest, and a leather portfolio stuffed with legal briefs filled the seat pocket as though she had moved in. Anthony paused, giving her the benefit of the doubt. Mistakes happened. People sat in the wrong seat all the time. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his tone even and courteous. "Excuse me, ma'am. I believe you're in my seat." The woman didn't even look up from the glossy pages of her magazine. "This is 1A, she said flatly. "I'm sitting here." Anthony held up his boarding pass, angled so she could see. "Yes, this is 1A, and I paid for it." She flipped a page slowly, the way someone does when they want to prove they are unbothered. Then, with a voice sharpened by entitlement, she dropped the words that froze the surrounding cabin. "I don't care what your ticket says. I'm not moving." The sentence sliced through the muted bustle of first class. Nearby passengers glanced up from their phones, earbuds, and coffee cups. Whispers stirred in the rows behind him. The woman's declaration wasn't just rude, it carried a weight of arrogance so casual it was chilling. She sat there like the seat was hers by birthright, her posture radiating an unspoken message: you don't belong here. Anthony felt the air around him thicken. He had seen this scene before, though never quite this public. At 45, he had lost count of the subtle slights, the sideways looks, the quiet assumptions that someone like him didn't quite fit the picture people carried in their minds of success. Wealth or belonging? Most times he let it slide, swallowing the indignity in silence. But tonight, after a week of back-to-back meetings where he had already endured too many microaggressions dressed up as small talk, he felt something in him draw a line. He inhaled, slow and steady, as he had learned to do in meditation, letting the breath cool the first flicker of anger. "Ma'am," he repeated, his voice firm but still professional. "I reserved and paid for this seat. I need you to check your boarding pass so we can resolve this." Her head snapped toward him now, eyes narrowing with incredulity, as if the mere request offended her. She didn't reach for her purse. She didn't move her scarf. Instead, she leaned back deeper into the cushion, crossing her legs with theatrical finality. "I was here first." "Find another seat?" she said, loud enough for row 2 to hear. Anthony's 6-foot frame seemed suddenly too large for the narrow aisle. Passengers brushed past him with hurried steps, irritation barely concealed as they tried to reach their own seats. He caught fragments of mutters holed up at the front. Always something. The weight of their impatience pressed against his back, an invisible push urging him to just give in. But he stayed rooted, boarding pass still in his hand. Inside, his mind was already wrestling. Do I let this go for the sake of peace? Do I swallow this like I've swallowed 100 other insults? Or do I stand firm, even if it makes everyone in this cabin uncomfortable? He looked at the woman again. Her confidence wasn't born of mistake. It was born of certainty that the system, the crew, the very atmosphere of this cabin would bend in her favor. Anthony felt it in his chest if he walked away now. If he accepted a lesser seat just to avoid conflict, he would be confirming every assumption she carried, that his comfort, his dignity, his rightful place could always be negotiated down. The hum of the engines outside shifted as the last few passengers boarded. The cabin smelled faintly of brewed coffee and recycled air. The overhead lights dimmed as the flight attendants prepared for takeoff. But at the front of first class, time seemed to hold its breath. Anthony straightened his shoulders. His voice, when it came again, was no longer merely polite. It carried the steel edge of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. "I'm not moving either," he said. And with that, the real conflict began. The first-class cabin of Global Air Flight 762 had the polished glow of exclusivity. Cream-colored leather seats gleamed under soft lighting. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of lavender from the cleaning crew. Flight attendants moved with practiced precision, tucking blankets into corners, adjusting pillows, offering bottled water to passengers who had already settled in. It was a sanctuary of order, designed to make travelers feel important. But in seat 1A, the illusion of order came undone. Catherine Wells sat like she owned the space. Her blonde hair was styled to perfection, framing a face touched up with just enough makeup to appear effortless. She held her Vogue magazine like a stage prop, turning the pages with a kind of exaggerated casualness, every flick of her wrist communicating disdain. Draped across the seat back was a Hermes scarf in muted gold. The Chanel handbag remained on the armrest, positioned deliberately so that anyone passing by would notice the brand. She had placed her leather portfolio in the seat pocket, stuffed with papers that gave off the aura of importance. Everything about her presence screamed permanence, as though she had claimed 1A by sovereign right. Anthony Cole remained standing in the narrow aisle, the boarding pass still in his hand. His patience was tested, but his posture stayed calm. Years in corporate boardrooms had trained him to keep his voice even when challenged, to project authority without aggression. Yet inside, he felt the stirrings of a familiar storm. Catherine did not glance up. She shifted her weight, crossing her legs, the pointed heel of her shoe dangling carelessly. The gesture wasn't just relaxed, it was territorial. Anthony thought of all the times in his life he had seen this scene in different forms. Meetings where his input had been dismissed until repeated by someone else. Hotel lobbies where staff assumed he wasn't a guest. Security checks where he was pulled aside while others walked freely past. Each moment carried the same unspoken message: you don't quite belong. And here it was again, embodied in Catherine Wells. Her indifference was the sharpest insult of all. She didn't even bother to justify herself, as if his protest was beneath consideration. Anthony shifted slightly, careful not to let frustration leak into his voice. "Ma'am," he said, "I paid for seat 1A. I need you to show me your boarding pass." Finally. She lowered the magazine and turned her head. Her eyes were cool, appraising. She studied him with the detached confidence of someone accustomed to winning. "I told you," she said, her voice crisp. "I'm sitting here. If it bothers you that much, I'm sure they can find you another seat." The words stung more than he expected. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it, like his rightful claim to the seat was an inconvenience, a nuisance she shouldn't have to deal with. Anthony inhaled deeply, steadying himself. The last thing he wanted was to raise his voice. He could already sense passengers in nearby rows watching the exchange with subtle interest, waiting to see how he would react. He considered his options. He could call over a flight attendant and let them handle it. But would they actually enforce the rules fairly? Experience told him not to expect much. He could walk away, accept a lesser seat, avoid the scene. But at what cost? He imagined the silent triumph on Catherine's face if he surrendered. He imagined the ripple of whispers through the cabin, another black man put in his place. He wasn't angry yet, but he felt the weight of choice pressing down on him. Catherine returned her gaze to the magazine, signaling the conversation was over in her mind. She had dismissed him, confident that her posture and presence would be enough to cement her victory. The quiet hum of the cabin seemed to amplify Anthony's thoughts. Why does this keep happening? Why must I always be the one to bend? Why is fairness so often treated as negotiable when it comes to me? He felt his chest tighten. He thought about his late father, a man who had taught him dignity was not something you surrendered. His father had been a postal worker, a man of modest means but unshakable integrity. Anthony remembered being a boy, watching his father insist on being treated with respect in small interactions, a clerk who skipped over him in line, a neighbor who dismissed his opinion. "Never let anyone make you smaller than you are," his father had said once, gripping his shoulder firmly. "You carry yourself with dignity, son, even when others refuse to see it." Those words echoed in Anthony's mind now. He looked at Catherine Wells, sprawled in a seat she had not paid for, embodying every ounce of entitlement his father had warned him about. He thought of his mother, too, a schoolteacher who had worked late nights to provide for him. She used to remind him that silence in the face of injustice wasn't politeness, it was complicity. Anthony shifted his grip on the boarding pass. He realized he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Passengers continued to board. A businessman in row 2 frowned at the delay. A young couple whispered to each other, glancing between Anthony and Catherine. The tension thickened, invisible but heavy, filling the cabin with unease. Catherine lifted her coffee cup, took a sip, and sighed dramatically as if bored with the entire exchange. Anthony felt a spark of resolve harden into something immovable. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, endured too many silent indignities to let this moment pass. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice steady, deliberate. "You need to check your boarding pass. Now." Her lips curved into a smirk. She tapped her magazine against her knee. "Why don't you let the crew handle this? You're holding up the plane." Anthony noticed the irony. She had been the one who created the disruption, but in her framing, he was the problem. He felt the sting of recognition. This was how systemic bias worked, not through blatant hostility, but through small manipulations of perception. Where the victim was painted as the aggressor, his jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed calm. He was not going to let her narrative become the truth. More passengers glanced their way now, sensing the scene had shifted from minor inconvenience to something more charged. A woman in row 3 whispered to her partner, "What's going on up there?" Anthony ignored the whispers. He focused only on Catherine, who reclined deeper into the seat with a look of satisfaction, as though she had already won. Inside, though, Anthony's determination crystallized. He wasn't going to raise his voice. He wasn't going to storm. But he also wasn't going to move. He had paid for 1A. He belonged in 1A. And no amount of indifference, arrogance, or subtle intimidation would change that. The hum of the engines deepened as the jet bridge pulled back. The final passengers rushed down the aisle, stashing bags in overhead compartments. But in seat 1A, the drama was far from over. Anthony remained standing, silent now, but radiating quiet defiance. The stage was set. The audience was watching, and the next move would not be his. The low murmur of passengers settling in filled the first-class cabin like static. Seatbelts clicked. Overhead compartments slammed shut. The subtle perfume of luxury clung to the air. Anthony Cole remained standing, boarding pass in hand, while Catherine Wells lounged in 1A as though it were a throne no one could challenge. Her magazine rested casually on her lap, its glossy cover reflecting the overhead lights. Every movement of hers, from the way she crossed her legs to the way she adjusted her scarf, sent the same unspoken message. "This is mine." Anthony's jaw tightened. He could feel the tension rolling through his body, yet his voice, when he finally spoke, carried no anger. It was calm, deliberate. He repeated his request one more time, asking Catherine to check her boarding pass. She did not budge. She did not reach for her purse. Instead, she shifted in her seat with calculated ease, a small smile playing on her lips. "Why don't you take another seat and stop making this difficult?" she said, her tone dripping with superiority. Anthony opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, a flight attendant approached. Laura Benson walked briskly down the aisle, her blonde hair tied neatly back, her navy blue uniform pressed to perfection. She wore a practiced smile, the kind designed to project reassurance even before a word was spoken. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her eyes sweeping the scene. Anthony felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone with authority who could resolve this quickly. He lifted his boarding pass, ready to hand it over. "Yes, there is," he said, his voice steady. "This is my assigned seat, 1A, but she's already sitting here." For the briefest moment, Laura's gaze flicked between Anthony and Catherine, and in that fraction of a second, Anthony noticed the change. The warmth in her eyes cooled when she looked at him. The smile she offered him was thinner, tighter, but when she turned to Catherine, her expression softened again. Warmer, almost deferential. Catherine wasted no time. "This gentleman is insisting I move," she said smoothly, as though she were the one being harassed. "I was here first. He's making a scene." Anthony's chest tightened. The framing was clear. Catherine positioned herself as the victim before Laura had even asked a question. And Laura, instead of immediately verifying boarding passes, simply nodded with sympathetic understanding. Anthony held up his ticket again. "I paid for this seat," he said firmly. "All she needs to do is show hers. That will settle this." Laura's smile faltered, just slightly, but she kept her voice even. "Sir, to avoid further inconvenience for our passengers, would you be willing to take another seat in business class? We'd be happy to refund the difference in fare. The service is just as excellent." The words struck Anthony like a slap. He stared at her, momentarily stunned. She had not asked Catherine for proof. She had not followed the most basic protocol. Instead, she had turned to him, the black man standing in the aisle, and suggested that he give up his rightful seat. It was not just unfair, it was humiliating. Anthony took a slow breath. Around him, he could feel the restless energy of the cabin growing. Passengers in rows 2 and 3 leaned forward, whispering. He caught fragments of their conversation. What's the hold-up? He should just sit somewhere else. The pressure was mounting, invisible hands pushing him toward compliance. He forced himself to remain calm. Losing his composure would only play into Catherine's narrative. "I paid for seat 1A, he said, his voice steady but firmer now. "I would like to sit in the seat I purchased." Laura's smile grew more strained, her patience thinning. She adjusted the scarf at her neck, a nervous tick she probably thought no one noticed. "Sir, I'm sure we can resolve this without making it unpleasant for anyone. Business class has very comfortable seats available." Anthony almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He had spent decades of his life working his way up, building his company, enduring slights and obstacles at every step. Now here he was, treated as if his claim to a seat he paid for was negotiable, while the woman who had blatantly taken it was shielded from scrutiny. Inside his mind, his thoughts churned. Should I give in? Should I take the other seat and avoid the humiliation of being labeled difficult? Is it worth standing my ground when I know how quickly these situations can turn against me? But then another voice rose inside him, quieter but stronger. If you give in now, what message do you send? Not just to Catherine, not just to this flight attendant, but to everyone watching. If you surrender your dignity, you tell them they were right to assume you don't belong. Anthony straightened his back. He had no intention of backing down. Passengers shifted in their seats, irritated by the delay. One man in row 2 muttered loudly, "Some people always have to make everything complicated." Another sighed, exasperated, as if Anthony's insistence on fairness was somehow selfish. The irony twisted in Anthony's chest. Catherine was the one who had stolen a seat. Catherine was the one refusing to cooperate, and yet he was the one painted as disruptive. It was a pattern he knew too well. Laura clasped her hands in front of her, her voice sweet but firm. "Sir, we really need to move forward. Please, take the other seat so we can depart." Anthony met her gaze directly. His voice was calm, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "No, I will sit in the seat I paid for. If there's confusion, let's check both boarding passes." A ripple of discomfort spread through the cabin. The suggestion was simple, logical, impossible to argue against. But Laura hesitated, glancing at Catherine, who shifted uneasily for the first time. Anthony felt a small surge of satisfaction. The cracks were beginning to show. Still, he knew this was far from over. The flight attendant's reluctance, Catherine's arrogance, the impatience of the passengers, everything was aligning against him. He could sense the storm brewing, but he also knew this storms did not scare him. He had weathered worse, and he was not moving. The cabin air felt heavier now, as if the tension itself had weight. Anthony Cole stood motionless, boarding pass still clutched between his fingers, while Catherine Wells remained sprawled in seat 1A. Laura Benson lingered at his side, her polite smile fading at the edges. She seemed unwilling to take the one simple step that could resolve everything, verify the boarding passes. Instead, her gaze darted toward the galley, silently calling for backup. Moments later, Michael Grant appeared. He moved down the aisle with the confidence of someone used to control. His uniform was immaculate, his graying hair neatly combed, his stride brisk and assertive. At 46, Michael carried himself like the embodiment of global air professionalism, a man who had diffused countless passenger disputes with a mix of authority and charm. "Good evening, sir," he said smoothly, addressing Anthony with a practiced tone that sounded polite on the surface but carried an undercurrent of condescension. "I understand there's some confusion about your seating arrangement." Anthony raised his boarding pass slightly. "There isn't confusion. This is my seat. 1A. She," he tilted his head toward Catherine, "is sitting in it." Michael's eyes shifted to Catherine, and immediately Anthony noticed the difference. Where Michael's expression toward him was controlled, cool, and guarded, his demeanor toward Catherine warmed instantly. He smiled, inclining his head slightly as though she were a guest of honor. "Ms. Wells, you're one of our Gold Elite members, aren't you?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with familiarity. Catherine leaned back in the seat, a faint smile curving her lips. "That's right. I've flown with Global Air for over 15 years. I'm always accommodated in first class when space permits." Anthony felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. Accommodated. That was the word they were using. He turned his eyes to Michael. "Accommodated doesn't mean you can take a paid seat from another passenger. I purchased 1A 3 weeks ago. I have the receipt. I have the boarding pass. This isn't about special treatment. It's about fairness." Michael's smile thinned. He exchanged a glance with Laura, subtle but unmistakable, before turning back to Anthony. "Sir, I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone. We have several excellent business class seats available. I'd be happy to offer you complimentary amenities for the inconvenience. Surely we can resolve this like reasonable adults." Anthony's stomach twisted. There it was again, that quiet, polished dismissal. Catherine's entitlement reframed as reasonableness. His insistence on fairness reframed as uncooperative stubbornness. His voice dropped lower, firmer. "I don't need compensation. I don't need another seat. I want the one I paid for, seat 1A. The exchange had drawn more eyes now. A businessman 2 rows back leaned forward, arms crossed. A woman in row 3 sighed loudly, clearly annoyed. The irritation of strangers pressed down on Anthony's shoulders like a weight, a collective impatience that demanded he yield. Inside, he wrestled with himself. How many times have I been here before? How many times have I swallowed the injustice just to keep things moving? How many times have I told myself it wasn't worth the fight? His father's words echoed in his memory. Never let anyone make you smaller than you are. Anthony steadied his voice. Why don't we do the simplest thing? Ask Ms. Wells to show her boarding pass. That will clear this up immediately. For the first time, Catherine shifted uneasily. The faintest flicker of uncertainty passed across her face, quickly masked by her carefully cultivated poise. She smoothed her scarf and forced a small laugh. Really, this is unnecessary, she said. I've already explained. I was here first. This gentleman is determined to make trouble. Anthony felt the sting of her words, sharpened by the murmurs of passengers who seemed to accept her framing. He was the problem, not the woman who had stolen a seat, not the crew who refused to follow procedure. Him. Michael's expression hardened. Sir, he said, voice clipped now, I need you to be flexible. We can't hold up departure over one seat. Please take the alternative arrangement. Anthony met his eyes. He refused to flinch. And I need you to do your job. Verify her boarding pass. That's all. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Laura shifted uncomfortably. Catherine crossed her arms, her magazine abandoned now. Michael straightened, his authority challenged in front of 200 passengers. Anthony could almost hear the calculations running in Michael's head. To demand Catherine's boarding pass would expose the crew's failure to follow protocol. It would risk embarrassing a white, elite-status passenger who had been treated like royalty for years. Far easier to pressure the black man into compliance, to paint his insistence on fairness as unreasonable. Anthony's mind churned. This is bigger than a seat. This is the same script, just a different stage. Bias cloaked in procedure, injustice dressed as compromise. How many people without my resources have been forced to swallow this? How many have been labeled disruptive just for asking for what they paid for? His heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. I am not moving. Michael exhaled sharply through his nose, his lips pressed into a thin line. Around them, the passengers' whispers grew louder, a chorus of impatience and judgment. A man muttered, "Just sit somewhere else." Another said, "We'll be here all night at this rate." Catherine leaned forward, seizing the moment. "This is exactly what I mean," she said, pitching her voice so others could hear. "He's being unreasonable. I don't feel safe with this kind of aggression directed at me." Anthony felt the words pierce like a blade. Aggression. He had been calm, measured, professional. Yet she weaponized the oldest stereotype, the most dangerous narrative that a black man's presence was threatening. Michael's eyes narrowed. Laura shifted her stance, clearly aligning herself with her superior. The crew was closing ranks, the narrative forming against him. Anthony gripped his boarding pass tighter. He refused to look away. He refused to yield. His dignity was not negotiable. The cabin felt like a theater now. Every passenger and audience member, every gesture amplified. The hum of the engines underscored the scene, a steady reminder of the journey delayed. Anthony knew what was coming. He had seen this before. The escalation, the invocation of authority, the threat of removal. But he also knew something else. He was not the same man he had been years ago, forced to accept these humiliations in silence. He had power now, resources, a platform. He could fight back. And when he looked at Catherine Wells, sitting smugly in a seat that wasn't hers, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not moving. The hum of the aircraft deepened as ground staff prepared for departure. Overhead, bins clicked shut. Passengers shuffled in their seats, fastening belts, adjusting headphones, settling for a flight that still had not moved, yet all eyes kept drifting back to the front row, where the standoff simmered. Anthony Cole stood tall, calm but unyielding, his boarding pass visible in his hand. Catherine Wells still sat in seat 1A, her body language radiating smug confidence. Michael Grant and Laura Benson flanked her like silent guardians, their authority forming a shield that protected her entitlement. The murmurs of frustration had grown louder. People were restless. Some whispered accusations at Anthony. Others shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Catherine but saying nothing. The imbalance of perception was stark. The woman who had broken the rules was shielded by politeness, while the man demanding fairness was painted as obstinate. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain Richard Fowler stepped into the cabin, silver hair perfectly combed, navy cap tucked neatly under his arm. His crisp uniform, with its 4 gold stripes, carried instant authority. At 55, Fowler embodied the archetype of airline command, disciplined, confident, accustomed to compliance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs, "I understand we have a seating dispute holding up departure." Heads turned, conversations quieted. The captain's presence brought a wave of silence, the kind that falls when ultimate authority enters the room. Anthony felt a surge of unease. He knew this moment well. In countless settings, the highest authority figure had entered not to seek truth, but to enforce order. Fowler's eyes swept the cabin, then settled on Anthony. "Sir," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "I'm going to need you to work with my crew so we can resolve this situation quickly. We have over 200 passengers waiting to depart." The phrasing was deliberate. Not, "We need to confirm whose seat this is," not, "Let's check the boarding passes." Instead, the captain framed the issue as Anthony's refusal to cooperate. Anthony's heartbeat slowed into a steady drum. He knew the trap when he saw it. If he resisted, he would be labeled disruptive. If he complied, he would validate the injustice. "Captain," he replied evenly, his voice carrying through the hushed cabin, "I am happy to resolve this. I simply want to sit in the seat I purchased. If Ms. Wells can show her boarding pass, this matter will be settled in seconds." The request was simple, logical, impossible to argue against. Yet Captain Fowler did not turn to Catherine. Instead, he fixed Anthony with a measured stare. "Sir, my crew has already offered you alternative accommodations. Your refusal to accept them is causing unnecessary delay. At this point, you are bordering on disruptive behavior. I need you to comply." The words struck like a hammer. Disruptive behavior. The phrase carried weight, the kind that could summon security, removal, even arrest. Anthony's chest tightened, but he did not flinch. He saw Catherine out of the corner of his eye, her lips curling into the faintest smile. She had played this script before. She knew how it worked. A man in row 2 muttered, "Just sit somewhere else already." Another voice, female this time, said, "Why make this harder than it needs to be?" Anthony felt the invisible tide of public opinion shift further against him. It was working, just as Catherine and the crew had intended. Inside, his mind churned. This is how it happens. The system reframes resistance as disruption. It weaponizes procedure to protect those it favors. And it counts on silence on bystanders accepting the narrative without question. He thought of his father again, the man who had taught him to stand tall even when the world tried to shrink him. He thought of his mother, reminding him that silence in the face of injustice was complicity. And he thought of the people watching now, every passenger whose eyes were fixed on him. What lesson would they take from this moment if he surrendered? Anthony inhaled slowly, steadying his voice. "Captain Fowler, with respect, I am not refusing instructions. I am asking for protocol to be followed. Please verify both boarding passes. That is the standard procedure in disputes like this." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Fowler's face, but only for an instant. His posture stiffened. "Sir, I have final authority on this aircraft. If you do not comply with my instructions, I may have no choice but to remove you." The threat hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the cabin. A woman in row 4 whispered, "Is he really going to remove him?" Another passenger shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable." Catherine seized the moment, her voice rising with theatrical concern. "I don't understand why this has to be so contentious," she said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "I've been accommodated in first class many times. This gentleman is determined to make trouble. Honestly, I feel unsafe. Unsafe." The word rang like an alarm bell in Anthony's mind. It was the ultimate weapon, the white woman's invocation of fear against a black man. She knew exactly what she was doing. Anthony stood rooted in place, his grip on the boarding pass unyielding. He felt the eyes of every passenger on him, some filled with irritation, others with unease, a few with sympathy. He felt the power of narrative pressing against him, threatening to erase his truth. But he also felt something else, a rising determination, cold and clear. He was done yielding, done accommodating, done letting dignity be treated as negotiable. "Captain Fowler," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I am not moving from the seat I paid for. If you believe I am disruptive for asking for fairness, then perhaps the disruption lies not with me, but with the way this situation is being handled." The silence that followed was electric. The passengers leaned in, sensing the moment had shifted. Catherine stiffened. Laura glanced nervously at Michael. Even Fowler paused, his authority momentarily unsettled by Anthony's measured defiance. Anthony's mind was clear now. He understood the stakes. This was not about comfort or convenience. It was about principle. It was about the countless times people like him had been told to step aside, to accept less, to be quiet for the sake of order. Not this time. He stood tall, calm, and immovable as the weight of 200 passengers' stares bore down on him. The crew had closed ranks. The captain had issued threats. Catherine had played her card, and Anthony Cole, son of a postal worker and a schoolteacher, CEO of his own company, a man who had fought for every inch of ground he stood on, refused to yield. The storm had reached its breaking point, and everyone on Global Air Flight 762 knew the next move would change everything. The silence in the first-class cabin had grown unbearable, stretched thin like glass about to shatter. Anthony Cole stood firm, boarding pass visible in his hand, while Catherine Wells sat in 1A with all the poise of someone certain the system would bend in her favor. Then Catherine leaned forward, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "I feel unsafe," she announced, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This man has been harassing me since I sat down. He's aggressive. I think we need security." The words detonated in the air. Aggressive, harassing, unsafe. Each one carried centuries of weight, conjuring an image not of the calm, composed man standing silently in the aisle, but of a threat that had to be contained. Anthony's breath caught in his chest. He had been careful, painfully careful. His voice never raised, his body language never hostile. Yet, with a few words, Catherine had twisted the narrative into something far more dangerous. Gasps rippled through the cabin. A woman in row 2 clutched her husband's arm. A man in row 3 muttered, "Unbelievable." But the disbelief wasn't about Catherine. It was aimed at Anthony, who now stood under the shadow of her accusation. Captain Richard Fowler straightened, his authority reinforced by her words. "That's enough," he said sharply. He reached for the radio clipped to his uniform. "Gate 17. This is Captain Fowler. We need security at the aircraft immediately. Passenger in first class is refusing instructions and causing a disturbance." The phrasing was deliberate, clinical. Refusing instructions, causing a disturbance. Not a man standing quietly while asking for fairness. No mention of Catherine's refusal to show her boarding pass. No acknowledgement of the obvious truth. The record would show Anthony as the problem. Anthony felt a cold fury settle over him. He had lived this script too many times before, but never this publicly, never with so much at stake. He forced himself to breathe evenly, though his pulse hammered in his ears. Passengers began to murmur more openly now. Some voiced irritation. "Just take another seat. We'll be here all night at this rate." Others whispered sympathy. A young black woman in business class raised her phone, recording discreetly, her jaw tight with recognition. An older couple in row 4 exchanged uneasy glances, as though debating whether to speak up. Anthony stood alone, the weight of judgment pressing down on him. Moments later, the cabin doors opened and 2 airport security officers entered. Their presence changed the atmosphere instantly. Authority had arrived, and with it, the possibility of escalation beyond words. Officer Miller stepped forward first, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his expression already stern. He was in his mid-40s, his posture exuding the expectation of immediate compliance. His hand rested lightly on his belt near the radio, the gesture casual yet unmistakably intimidating. Behind him came Officer Ramirez, younger, mid-30s, with sharp eyes that scanned the scene carefully. He moved slower, his demeanor less confrontational, more observant. Captain Fowler Miller asked, his voice brisk. Fowler nodded. "This passenger," he gestured toward Anthony, "has refused direct instructions from my crew. He's causing a delay and making other passengers uncomfortable. We need him removed." Miller turned his gaze on Anthony, his expression already hardened into suspicion. "Sir, you need to comply with crew instructions or we'll have to escort you off the aircraft." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to obedience. Anthony inhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Officer, I am not refusing instructions. I am standing in front of the seat I paid for. This woman is in it. All I've asked is that her boarding pass be checked." He held up his ticket. "Mine clearly says 1A. Ramirez tilted his head, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. He glanced from Anthony to Catherine to the crew. "Has anyone verified both boarding passes?" he asked. The question hung in the air. Simple, yet devastating. Michael Grant and Laura Benson exchanged a quick look, their discomfort obvious. Fowler's jaw tightened. "We've been trying to resolve this through reasonable accommodations," Michael said defensively. "Mr. Cole has refused every alternative we've offered." Ramirez shook his head slightly. "That's not what I asked. Have you checked both boarding passes?" Anthony felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone was cutting through the fog of misdirection. He turned his gaze on Catherine, who shifted in her seat, her composure cracking ever so slightly. Her hands fumbled with the magazine in her lap. Catherine's voice rose again, sharp and indignant. "I've flown with this airline for 15 years. I've never been treated like this. He's been hostile from the moment he boarded. This is harassment." Miller's eyes hardened further. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. You need to move now." Ramirez held up a hand. "Wait, I haven't seen any aggression here." He's standing calmly. "Before we escalate, let's confirm the documentation." For a moment, the two officers stood in quiet tension, their contrasting perspectives clear. Miller radiated readiness to enforce authority without question. Ramirez radiated skepticism, a refusal to rubber stamp a narrative that didn't add up. Anthony seized the moment. His voice was low, measured, but strong. "This can be resolved in seconds. Ask her to show her boarding pass. That's all." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every passenger seemed to lean forward, breath held, waiting to see what Catherine would do. Her face tightened. Her hand hovered over her handbag. For the first time, her confidence faltered. She stalled, fumbling longer than necessary, as though searching for a document she already knew would betray her. Anthony's pulse slowed, steady and cold. The truth was about to surface, but even before the proof appeared, he felt a grim satisfaction settle deep within him. For all the noise, all the accusations, all the authority stacked against him, the system was cracking under the weight of its own contradictions, and he had not moved. The cabin of Global Air Flight 762 was silent, the kind of silence that came not from calm, but from collective anticipation. Every passenger in first class leaned forward, eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in row 1. Anthony Cole stood like a pillar, his boarding pass visible in his steady hand. Catherine Wells sat in 1A, her composure cracking as the weight of expectation pressed down on her. Officer Ramirez broke the silence. His tone was firm but calm, the kind of voice that carried authority without intimidation. "Ma'am, please present your boarding pass." Catherine hesitated. Her fingers hovered over her handbag, grazing the zipper. But she did not move. Her lips pressed into a thin line. The stillness of her hands betrayed her. Anthony's eyes never left her. He could see the calculation in her expression, the realization that the bluff might finally collapse. Officer Miller's voice cut sharply through the tension. "Let's not waste more time. Sir, you need to step aside while we sort this out." His words carried the impatience of a man who had already chosen his side. But Ramirez did not yield. He repeated, slower this time, his voice carrying the weight of procedure. "Ma'am, for the record, please show your boarding pass." Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering, "Why doesn't she just show it?" One man muttered. A woman in business class whispered to her partner, "Something's off. If it were really hers, she'd have shown it already." Catherine inhaled sharply, feigning indignation. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice louder now, as though volume could substitute for truth. "I've been treated like a criminal when I've done nothing wrong. I have elite status. I shouldn't be subjected to this humiliation." Her words hung in the air, a desperate appeal for sympathy. But the tide was shifting. Doubt had crept into the cabin, and the silence of the other passengers was no longer supportive. It was skeptical. Ramirez extended his hand, his expression firm. "Boarding pass. Now." The mask slipped. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she unzipped her bag and pulled out the crumpled slip of paper. She handed it over with a sharp flick of her wrist, her chin tilted defiantly, as though attitude could erase the truth. Ramirez unfolded the pass and studied it. His brows lifted slightly. Then he looked at Miller, then at the crew, then at the captain. "This boarding pass is for seat 14F, economy, not 1A. The words dropped like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the cabin. A businessman in row 2 muttered, "Unbelievable." Someone further back whispered, 14F. She was lying the whole time. Anthony felt the rush of vindication, cool and steady. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply stood in silence, his dignity intact. Catherine's face flushed crimson, but she did not move. Instead, she clutched her designer handbag tightly, her knuckles white. "This must be a mistake," she said quickly, her voice pitched higher now. "I was upgraded. I always get upgraded." Michael Grant stepped forward, his face paling. "That may be possible," he stammered, searching for an escape. Perhaps there was a system error, but the lie crumbled under its own weight. Ramirez shook his head. "No. The manifest confirmed seat 1A is assigned to Mr. Anthony Cole. There's no record of an upgrade for Ms. Wells." Passengers began murmuring louder now. The young woman in business class, still recording on her phone, muttered under her breath, "Got you." A man in row 3 leaned back, shaking his head, and they were about to kick him off. Anthony's chest swelled with a quiet pride. He had stood his ground, endured the storm, and the truth had emerged. But his pride was tempered by a deeper anger, not just at Catherine, but at the system that had aligned so quickly against him. Captain Fowler cleared his throat, his authority dented. "Well, it appears there was some misunderstanding." His voice lacked the certainty it had carried before. He glanced at Michael and Laura, their faces tight with embarrassment. Anthony's voice was calm but carried across the cabin with clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a refusal to follow procedure. From the moment I asked for her boarding pass to be checked, this could have been resolved. Instead, I was accused of aggression and threatened with removal. The truth of his words hung heavy in the air. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, aware now of how easily perception could have condemned an innocent man. Catherine sank lower in her seat, her confidence shattered. She avoided Anthony's gaze, staring instead at her hands, which trembled slightly in her lap. Officer Miller's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to Ramirez, who folded the boarding pass and handed it back to Catherine. "You'll need to move to your assigned seat, ma'am." The humiliation was complete. Murmurs followed her as she stood reluctantly, gathering her things. Her scarf slipped from her shoulders, and for the first time her poise looked fragile, almost pitiful. Anthony stepped aside silently, allowing her to pass. He lowered himself into seat 1A, finally claiming the space that was his by right. The leather felt firm beneath him, not luxurious but symbolic. It was not comfort that mattered, it was principle. The murmurs continued even after Catherine disappeared down the aisle. She lied. They almost threw him off for that unbelievable. The young woman in business class lowered her phone, her eyes meeting Anthony's with a look of quiet solidarity. Anthony leaned back, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The adrenaline still pulsed through his body, but beneath it was a deeper ache. He had won this battle, but at a cost: the humiliation of public accusation, the weight of suspicion, the reminder of how fragile dignity could be when others refused to see it. His thoughts turned inward. How many others don't have the means to fight back? How many are silenced because they're too afraid of what might happen if they resist? His father's words echoed once more. Never let anyone make you smaller than you are. He opened his eyes, staring straight ahead. The battle wasn't over. The truth had been exposed, but the system that allowed it to unfold still loomed large, and Anthony Cole knew, in that moment, that he would not let it end here. For now, though, he sat quietly in seat 1A, a man vindicated but not yet satisfied, as Global Air Flight 762 prepared at last to push back from the gate. For several long moments after Catherine Wells shuffled down the aisle, the first-class cabin of Global Air Flight 762 remained unsettled. The atmosphere was thick, not with relief, but with the echo of what had just transpired. Conversations stirred like ripples on water, voices overlapping in whispers that carried the sting of judgment and disbelief. Anthony Cole sat quietly in seat 1A, his body finally sinking into the leather that he had rightfully claimed. He kept his posture steady, his hands resting on his knees, and his expression neutral. Outwardly, he was calm. Inwardly, his thoughts churned with intensity. He replayed each moment, every insult, every assumption, the humiliating threats of removal, and the faces of those who had judged him guilty without question. He could still hear the woman in row 2 saying she paid for first class to avoid people like this. The words had cut deeper than she could ever know. He was not just a man who had defended his seat. He was a man forced to remind others that his dignity was not negotiable. Laura Benson, the flight attendant who had first approached, avoided his eyes as she busied herself with trays at the galley. Her smile, once confident, faltered each time she glanced toward him. Michael Grant stood near the cockpit door, arms crossed, his jaw tight. The arrogance that had once bolstered him was gone, replaced by something else: fear. He knew this incident was no longer a routine conflict. It was becoming something larger, something that would follow them long after the wheels left the ground. Captain Fowler's voice broke the cabin silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will be departing shortly." His announcement was clipped, forced, as though he hoped authority could patch over the cracks that had been revealed. But the murmurs didn't stop. Passengers weren't ready to forget what they had witnessed. Anthony glanced sideways as a woman in row 3 leaned toward her husband, her voice sharp with indignation. They were going to throw him off, and for what she was in the wrong the whole time. Her husband nodded, whispering back. If Officer Ramirez hadn't spoken up, they would have humiliated him completely. Did you see how quick they were to believe her? The young black woman in business class, still clutching her phone, whispered to a man beside her, "This needs to be shared." People need to see how fast bias plays out. It's not subtle when you watch it like this. Anthony heard fragments of their words, and though he remained stoic, his chest tightened with a mix of validation and sorrow. Validation that others had seen the truth. Sorrow that it had taken this spectacle for them to recognize it. His mind turned briefly to his daughter, Maya. She was 15, sharp-witted and already keenly aware of how the world saw her. He imagined her face if she saw the video. Would she feel pride that her father had stood firm, or fear at the reminder of how precarious their dignity was in spaces where they were always questioned? He wrestled with the thought. He had taught her to be strong, to know her worth. But he never wanted her to carry the burden of watching her father treated as though he did not belong. His phone buzzed against his thigh. He glanced discreetly at the screen. It was a message from his executive assistant. "Carla, flight delay flagged on internal systems. Are you safe?" Anthony's lips pressed into a thin line. The irony burned. His own airline holdings were monitoring the disruption caused by this injustice, unaware that the man in the middle of it all was their chairman. Officer Ramirez lingered near row 1, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smug about being right. He wasn't triumphant. He looked tired, like a man who had seen too many scenes just like this. Miller, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier certainty eroded by the revelation. He avoided Anthony's gaze, pretending to study the overhead compartments. Anthony's voice broke the uneasy quiet in his immediate row. He didn't raise it, but it carried nonetheless. It shouldn't take 30 minutes, a scene, and a boarding pass to confirm the truth. His words were directed at no one and everyone. Passengers listened. Some nodded. Laura's hand froze mid-reach for a cup. Michael glanced away. Anthony continued, his tone even almost reflective. "What concerns me more than the seat itself is how quickly assumptions became facts, how quickly someone's word outweighed documentation, how quickly I was labeled disruptive." The truth of his statement hung in the air. Undeniable. A man in row 2 shifted uncomfortably, whispering, "He's right." Catherine Wells' absence down in economy class was felt like a shadow. The cabin seemed to carry the echo of her accusations, the sting of her claim that she felt unsafe. Those words had nearly cost Anthony his dignity, and everyone knew it now. Anthony wrestled internally. He had options. He could let the incident end here, satisfied that the truth was exposed. Or he could press forward, force accountability, make this more than a private humiliation turned vindication. His instincts as a leader told him this was bigger than him. His instincts as a man told him he was tired of always having to fight, tired of always being the one who had to prove he belonged. He remembered his father's lessons, the nights when they had sat on the porch in Georgia, the elder Cole explaining the unspoken rules of survival. "Son, sometimes you let it go, but sometimes you plant your feet and you don't move. You have to know the difference." Anthony knew this was the latter. This was not just his fight. Passengers' voices grew bolder now. The elderly couple in row 4 whispered to one another. Then the woman leaned forward, speaking across the aisle. "Mr. Cole, I saw how they treated you. It was wrong. We've flown Global Air for years, but I've never seen something handled so poorly." Anthony inclined his head politely. "Thank you." "Your words matter more than you think," her husband added. "Don't let them sweep this under the rug." Anthony studied their faces. Strangers, yet allies, witnesses whose perspectives could not be dismissed. Laura finally approached, her hands trembling slightly as she poured water into a glass. She placed it on Anthony's tray table, her voice barely audible. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience earlier." Anthony looked at her, his eyes steady. This wasn't an inconvenience. It was a violation. Words won't fix that. Her face flushed, and she stepped back quickly, retreating toward the galley. Michael moved down the aisle, speaking quietly with Captain Fowler. Their hushed tones betrayed their unease. They knew the narrative had shifted beyond their control. Anthony leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He thought of the systems he had built, the teams he led, the culture he cultivated in his own company. If one of his employees had treated a client the way he had just been treated, there would be consequences. Why should this airline be any different? The hum of the engines began as the aircraft finally prepared to taxi, but the tension in the cabin did not ease. It clung to every corner, every seat. The passengers had seen too much to return to normalcy. Anthony clasped his hands together and exhaled slowly. He would not act rashly, but he would act. His mind was already shaping the strategy, considering the calls he would make once they landed. For now, he allowed the silence to stretch, allowed the weight of the moment to sink into the minds of those around him. As the plane began its slow roll toward the runway, the young woman with the phone caught his eye once again. She mouthed two words silently. "Thank you." Anthony gave the faintest nod, not of triumph, but of acknowledgement. He had not chosen this fight, but he had chosen not to surrender. And in that choice, he had lit a spark that would not easily be extinguished. The engines roared louder, the plane gathering speed. Passengers braced for takeoff, but Anthony's thoughts were already soaring ahead. This incident was no longer confined to row one of a Boeing aircraft. It was part of something larger, something systemic. And when the wheels lifted from the ground, Anthony knew with certainty that this flight would mark the beginning of a reckoning. The engines roared as Global Air Flight 762 lifted from the ground, climbing steadily into the darkening sky over Boston. The city lights shimmered below, fading into a sea of scattered pinpricks as the aircraft pierced through the clouds. Normally, the quiet after takeoff carried a sense of relief. Tonight, the cabin was filled with a silence that felt taut, stretched thin, like it could snap at any second. Anthony Cole sat motionless in seat 1A, staring straight ahead. The hum of the engines provided a steady background, but his mind was not at rest. His thoughts churned in measured waves, each one circling back to the humiliation he had endured just minutes earlier. He thought of Catherine Wells, now seated in 14F, stripped of her entitlement, yet leaving behind the echo of her accusations. He thought of Michael Grant and Laura Benson, the crew who had so quickly chosen sides. And he thought of Captain Fowler, who had wielded authority like a weapon instead of a shield. Anthony's heart was steady, but beneath that calm surface lay a cold fire. It was not anger for anger's sake. It was clarity, a clarity sharpened by years of being tested in boardrooms where his presence had been questioned before his competence had ever been considered. He had spent his life proving himself over and over again. Yet on this plane, with his ticket in his hand, even proof was not enough. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering his daughter Maya's laugh, her unguarded joy when she had called him the week before to tell him she aced her math exam. He imagined her scrolling through social media one day, stumbling upon a video of this very incident. Would she see her father as strong, or would she see him as a man forced to defend his dignity against the casual cruelty of strangers? That thought pressed heavily on his chest. Around him, the cabin shifted. Passengers pretended to read magazines or watch movies, but their glances betrayed them. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with unease, and a few with embarrassment, as if ashamed of their silence earlier. He could feel their eyes flicker toward him and away again, as though acknowledging him meant confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. The young black woman in business class had kept her phone tucked away after recording. Every so often, her eyes met Anthony's. There was no pity in her gaze, only recognition. She knew. She had lived enough to understand exactly what had just happened. Her silent solidarity gave him strength. Laura Benson returned to the aisle, her professional smile restored like a mask hastily glued back in place. She moved stiffly, her hands too precise, her gestures rehearsed. When she reached Anthony's row, she hesitated. He looked up, waiting. She finally spoke, her voice thin. "Would you care for a beverage?" "Mr." Cole Anthony studied her for a moment before replying. "No, thank you." His tone was courteous, but his eyes held hers, unblinking, until she shifted uncomfortably and moved on. He wanted her to feel the weight of her choices, the realization that a smile after the fact could not erase what had been done. Michael Grant lingered near the galley, his shoulders rigid, his conversation with the captain hushed but urgent. Anthony could imagine their words. They were worried now. They had seen the truth revealed, and they knew their actions were recorded in the minds of passengers, and possibly in the lens of a camera. Anthony's phone buzzed again. A message from Carla monitoring flight delay. Alerts triggered. Should I notify Elliot? He considered the question carefully. Elliot Morgan, Global Air's CEO, was not just an acquaintance, but someone who had shaken his hand in boardrooms, pledged commitments to diversity and fairness, and boasted of Global Air's customer-first policies. Did Elliot know his employees had nearly dragged his largest shareholder off a plane for daring to claim what was his? Anthony's jaw tightened. Not yet. Timing mattered. Elliot would hear about this, but Anthony would choose the moment. The plane leveled off, the seatbelt sign chiming softly. A businessman in row 2 finally leaned across the aisle, speaking just loud enough for Anthony to hear. "Sir, I just want to say I saw everything. You handled yourself with more composure than most people could have. If it had been me, I don't think I could have stayed so calm." Anthony gave a faint nod. Calm was the only choice I had. The man hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry for what you went through. It shouldn't have happened." Anthony's lips curved into a polite smile, though his eyes remained somber. "Thank you. Words matter, especially when they're spoken after silence." The man flushed slightly, recognizing the truth in Anthony's remark. His silence earlier had been part of the problem, and now his apology was part of the reckoning. As the cabin lights dimmed, Anthony leaned back, closing his eyes once more. He allowed himself to replay the pivotal moment, the demand for Catherine's boarding pass, the hesitation, the exposure of her lie. The image of Ramirez reading aloud the words, "Seat 14F," replayed in his mind like a line from a script. It had changed everything, but it also raised questions. Why had it taken Ramirez alone to ask the simplest of questions? Why had Miller, Michael, Laura, and even the captain chosen to escalate rather than verify? The answer was clear. It was never about the boarding pass. It was about who they chose to believe. His thoughts turned darker, spiraling into the weight of history. This was not an isolated moment. This was the latest in a long pattern that stretched back decades, centuries. A pattern where black dignity was negotiable, where truth was secondary to perception, where authority sided with comfort rather than justice. He had fought these battles in boardrooms with polished tables and tailored suits. Tonight, he had fought it in an aisle cramped between armrests and glaring eyes. A soft voice broke through his reverie. It was the elderly woman from row 4. She leaned forward, speaking gently. "Mr. Cole, if you ever need me to share what I saw tonight, I'll do it. You deserve that much." Anthony turned to her, surprised by her directness. Her eyes were kind but firm. She was not offering pity. She was offering her voice. "Thank you," he said quietly. "The truth will matter, and so will the voices that carry it." Her husband nodded beside her, his hand resting on hers. "We won't forget what happened here." Anthony felt a swell of gratitude, tempered by sadness. For every witness willing to speak, there had been others content to look away. That was the struggle he had lived with his whole life. The cabin settled into a strange rhythm. Drinks were poured, trays distributed, movies flickered on screens. But beneath the routine, the air was different. Every clink of glass, every muted laugh carried the undertone of what had just happened. The illusion of ordinary flight had been shattered, and everyone aboard knew it. Anthony opened his laptop briefly, the glow illuminating his face. He pulled up a blank document and typed 3 words, "Systemic Accountability Plan." Then he closed it. The time for drafting would come later. For now, the words served as a promise to himself, to Maya, to every passenger who had been made to feel small for daring to exist where they belonged. He exhaled slowly, feeling the plane slice through the night sky. This was not just a flight, it was a stage. And every person on board had become part of a story much larger than themselves. Anthony rested his head against the seat, his eyes heavy, but his mind alert. He would land in San Francisco not just as a passenger, but as a man carrying the weight of justice yet to be demanded. He did not know yet how far this moment would ripple. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The silence he had endured tonight would not be the silence he carried forward. At 35,000 feet, the world below disappeared into endless dark. The cabin lights glowed soft amber, and the sound of engines filled the silence that still clung to Global Air Flight 762. For most passengers, this was the point in a flight where routine comfort settled in dinner trays, movie screens, a glass of wine to pass the time. Tonight, the atmosphere was fractured. The confrontation that had nearly ejected Anthony Cole from his rightful seat lingered in the air, impossible to erase. Anthony sat still in 1A, his laptop closed, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. He had traveled millions of miles in his life, across continents and oceans, in first-class cabins where anonymity was both a shield and a privilege. But tonight, he felt neither shielded nor privileged. Tonight, he felt exposed, not because he lacked power, but because he had chosen to use restraint. He had stood tall, calm, professional, and still. They had tried to strip him of his dignity. The quiet within him wasn't peace. It was calculation. Every detail of the incident was etched into his mind like an executive briefing, the dismissive tilt of Catherine Wells' chin when she declared the seat hers. The condescending patience in Michael Grant's voice, the subtle frost in Laura Benson's smile, the captain's threat disguised as authority. He remembered the way passengers' eyes had judged him before they knew the truth, the muttered comments about attitude problems and people like this. And he remembered the lifeline, the single moment when Officer Ramirez demanded the boarding pass, cutting through the fog of bias with one simple act of procedure. Anthony replayed it all, not for vindication, but for clarity. The problem wasn't one woman lying her way into a seat. The problem was the machinery that supported her lie until it was undeniable. Dinner service began, the metallic rattle of carts echoing down the aisle. Laura moved toward the first-class cabin again, her posture stiff, her face carefully arranged in the neutral smile of service. She paused at Anthony's row, asking softly, "Mr. Cole, would you like the salmon or the beef?" Anthony studied her for a moment before answering. His voice was low, but his words deliberate. "Which one is reserved for the people you believe belong here?" Her hand froze on the tray for a heartbeat. She said nothing. Then, with a flush creeping into her cheeks, she whispered, "The salmon, sir." "I'll take the beef," he replied evenly. She set the plate before him, retreating quickly down the aisle. Her composure cracked. Anthony did not look at her again. The exchange wasn't about food, it was about memory. He wanted her to remember how it felt to be confronted with the truth, even in subtle ways. Passengers watched the interaction in silence. Some exchanged knowing looks. Others kept their eyes on their trays. No one dared speak the words everyone was thinking. The balance of authority in this cabin had shifted. Michael Grant approached minutes later, his shoulders stiff under the weight of invisible judgment. He leaned down slightly, his voice low but urgent. "Mr. Cole, I'd like to extend my personal apology for earlier. We misjudged the situation. It was never our intention to make you feel unwelcome." Anthony's fork paused midair. He turned his head slowly to meet Michael's eyes. "You didn't misjudge the situation," Anthony said calmly. "You judged exactly how you were trained to judge. You chose who to believe before you had facts, and you assumed I was the disruption that needed to be managed." Michael swallowed hard, his confidence unraveling. "We were trying to resolve things quickly, to avoid delaying the flight. And in that haste, you almost threw me off this plane," Anthony replied, his voice even, but heavy with controlled force. "Tell me, Mr. Grant, would you have acted the same way if our roles had been reversed? If I sat in a seat I hadn't paid for, and a white woman stood calmly with a boarding pass in her hand?" Michael's mouth opened, then closed. No words came. He straightened, nodding stiffly, and walked away. The passengers nearby had heard enough to understand. The silence that followed was its own indictment. Anthony took a slow breath, his chest tightening. He did not relish shaming them, but he would not allow them to retreat into polite apologies without facing the truth. The hours passed slowly. Movies flickered on small screens, wine glasses clinked, and yet the atmosphere never fully relaxed. Anthony felt the weight of eyes on him, not hostile anymore, but curious, unsettled, reflective. People were thinking, perhaps more deeply than they ever had during a flight. He opened his notebook and wrote deliberately, each word chosen with care. It begins with a seat, but it ends with a system. If dignity can be negotiated here, it can be negotiated anywhere. He closed the notebook, knowing the words would shape what came next. As the plane soared over the Midwest, Anthony allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Memories surged, his father warning him as a boy never to forget that the rules weren't written for men like them. His first experience of being followed in a department store at 16. The sting of being mistaken for a chauffeur at a business conference where he was the keynote speaker. He thought of Maya again, her bright eyes and the questions she would one day ask. He wanted her to live in a world where she didn't need to doubt her place. But tonight reminded him that world was still far away. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "How many more times will I have to prove it?" Ramirez passed through the cabin, pausing at Anthony's row. His expression was professional, but his eyes held a flicker of respect. He didn't say much, only nodded, as if to affirm, "I saw, I know." Anthony returned the nod, a silent exchange of gratitude. Ramirez had done what others would not follow, the truth rather than the bias. The hours dragged until finally the announcement came that they were beginning their descent into San Francisco. The lights brightened, trays were cleared, and seatbacks lifted. Anthony fastened his belt, staring out the window at the city lights glittering like a sea of fireflies. He felt the weight of the night settle over him, but he also felt a clarity sharper than ever. This was not going to end with landing. This was not going to be swept under the rug. Every person in this cabin had witnessed something profound, the near erasure of a man's dignity, undone only by persistence and truth. Anthony knew the story would travel further than the aisles of this aircraft. The ripples had already begun. As the wheels touched down on the runway, the cabin shook lightly. Passengers clapped half-heartedly, a tradition more habit than celebration. Yet the applause tonight felt different, like an attempt to cover something unresolved. Anthony unbuckled his seatbelt, gathering his belongings slowly. He moved with deliberation, every action measured, every glance purposeful. Around him, passengers whispered softly. They knew they had been part of something that would not fade. He straightened his blazer, exhaled, and thought to himself, "The landing is only the beginning." The wheels of Global Air Flight 762 kissed the runway at San Francisco International with a jolt that shook passengers awake from restless thoughts. The landing gear hummed and the engines roared in reverse thrust. But inside the cabin, silence reigned. Not the silence of routine arrivals, but of a group of people who knew they had just lived through something that would not end with the flight. Anthony Cole sat in seat 1A, his eyes fixed on the cabin ahead, unblinking. His hands were steady on his lap, though beneath the stillness he could feel the tightness of restraint in his chest. As the plane slowed, passengers shifted, phones lit up, and notifications pinged. Somewhere behind him, the young black woman who had recorded the confrontation earlier whispered into her phone. She was uploading the video. Anthony did not ask, but he knew. The story was already leaving the walls of the aircraft. Captain Fowler's voice broke the silence over the intercom, strained but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. The local time is 9:47 p.m. Please remain seated until we reach the gate." The announcement felt hollow, his authority punctured. Even his tone betrayed unease, as if he knew that every word was being weighed against what passengers had seen. Anthony glanced sideways as Laura Benson passed through the cabin, her smile brittle, her posture too stiff. She asked perfunctory questions about whether passengers needed assistance, but no one responded warmly. People nodded curtly or ignored her altogether. The trust between crew and customers had been fractured, and everyone could feel it. The jet bridge connected with a metallic thud. The seatbelt sign switched off, and passengers rose like a tide, pulling bags from overhead bins, adjusting coats, murmuring into phones, yet before the shuffle of departure could sweep him into anonymity. Anthony remained seated. He waited. He wanted to be the last off, to feel the gravity of what lingered. The elderly couple in row 4 paused as they passed his row. The woman leaned toward him, her voice quiet but steady. "Mr. Cole, if there's anything we can do, we'll testify. We saw everything." Anthony inclined his head in gratitude. "Thank you. Your voice matters." Her husband placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, nodding at Anthony with solemn respect. Then they moved on. The businessman from row 2 also lingered for a moment, guilt still etched on his face. "Sir, I should have spoken sooner, but I'll speak now. If you need me." Anthony's voice was calm. "Better late than never. But remember, silence has a cost." The man nodded, shame burning in his eyes, before disappearing into the line of exiting passengers. Finally. Anthony rose, his tall frame commanding presence even in the cramped cabin. He reached for his carry-on with deliberate movements, feeling the eyes of crew and passengers alike follow him. He walked down the aisle slowly, every step heavy with meaning. He passed row 14 without looking, though he could sense Catherine Wells shrinking into her seat, her face turned toward the window, her once proud posture reduced to a huddled silhouette. The contrast struck him, entitlement stripped bare, dignity laid low by truth. At the doorway, Michael Grant stood beside Laura, both trying to summon remnants of professionalism. Michael forced a smile that faltered when Anthony met his eyes. "Mr. Cole," Michael began, his voice hushed, "I truly regret how this unfolded. Please allow us to make it right." Anthony paused in the doorway, his gaze steady, his words sharp but quiet enough to sting. "You can't make right what you chose to make wrong. What you can do is remember this the next time you decide whose word carries weight." Michael swallowed hard, his face pale. Anthony stepped past him, his polished shoes striking the threshold of the jet bridge like a gavel against wood. Outside the cabin, the air felt different, cooler, less oppressive. Yet the weight of what had happened followed him. He walked with measured steps through the terminal, his phone buzzing incessantly in his pocket. Messages from Carla, from board members, from colleagues. Crisis alerts had been triggered. His name was already tied to a flight delay spreading across Global Air's internal systems. He stopped near a window overlooking the tarmac, the glow of runway lights stretching across the night. He pulled out his phone and answered Carla's call. "Anthony." Her voice rushed with urgency. "What's happening? We're getting alerts. Passenger reports, delays, security involvement. The board's asking questions." Anthony's voice was calm, even measured. "Carla, initiate Crisis Protocol 7. I want full documentation gathered. Start pulling witness accounts. This won't be swept away." There was a pause on the line. Then Carla said softly, "Understood." "Are you all right?" Anthony exhaled slowly. "I'm steady, but this isn't just about me. It's about a system that thought I didn't belong in 1A. As he ended the call, he became aware of movement behind him. Officer Ramirez approached, his steps careful, his expression neutral. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Mr. Cole," Ramirez said quietly, "I wanted to apologize on behalf of security. It should never have gone that far. I know you didn't need validation from me, but I also know what it means when no one asks the right question. You shouldn't have had to fight for that seat." Anthony studied him, reading sincerity in his eyes. "You followed procedure. That's all I ever wanted. One person asking for proof when everyone else was content with assumption. Don't underestimate what that meant." Ramirez nodded once, firmly. "If you need my statement, I'll provide it. Word for word. You'll be hearing from my team," Anthony replied. Ramirez inclined his head before stepping away, his presence fading into the bustle of the terminal. Anthony felt a quiet surge of respect. Even in systems tilted by bias, individuals could choose integrity. The crowd around the baggage claim was buzzing. Some passengers spoke animatedly into phones, retelling the confrontation. Others scrolled through feeds already filling with posts about the man in 1A. Anthony overheard fragments. They almost kicked him off. "She was lying the whole time. It's all on video." Anthony picked up his bag and moved through the terminal with quiet determination. Every step felt like the opening chapter of something larger, something far beyond a dispute over a seat. This was not just about one flight. It was about every flight, every train, every boardroom, every space where dignity was questioned. His phone rang again. The caller ID flashed a name he had expected: Elliot Morgan, CEO of Global Air. Anthony stopped walking, squared his shoulders, and answered. "Anthony!" Elliot's voice came through tense, urgent. "I just got an emergency briefing about a serious incident on one of our flights. I understand you were involved. What happened out there?" Anthony's reply was slow, deliberate, each word sharpened by truth. "What happened?" "Elliot, is that your crew tried to remove me from the seat I purchased? They sided with a passenger who lied, who accused me of aggression, and they only relented when one security officer demanded proof. Your systems flagged a delay, but they didn't flag the bias that caused it. That's what happened." There was silence on the line, followed by Elliot's shaken exhale. "Anthony, I didn't know. I swear to you, we'll address this immediately." Anthony's gaze drifted across the terminal, the faces of travelers rushing past. "This isn't about words, Elliot. It's about action, and action starts now." He ended the call before the CEO could respond, sliding the phone back into his pocket. His decision was clear. He would not let this moment fade into another apology lost in corporate spin. He would demand accountability. He would demand reform. As he walked toward the exit, the night air of San Francisco awaited, cool and bracing. The city stretched ahead, but Anthony's mind was already racing toward the boardrooms, the courtrooms, the hearings that would follow. Tonight, one flight had revealed the fault lines of an entire system. Tomorrow, those lines would begin to crack. Anthony Cole adjusted his blazer, lifted his chin, and stepped into the night with the steady stride of a man who knew he carried the weight of more than just his own dignity. He carried the beginning of change. By the time Anthony Cole stepped into the cool night air of San Francisco, the story was already racing ahead of him. The video recorded on Global Air Flight 762 had begun its unstoppable spread across social media, shared and reshared until it became impossible to ignore. In living rooms, on news feeds, and in offices across the country. People watched as Anthony stood calmly with his boarding pass while a white passenger claimed his seat, and a crew nearly forced him off the plane. They saw the moment Officer Ramirez revealed the truth, the moment the cabin gasped, the moment silence turned into recognition. Within hours, hashtags trended, "Tier Seat 1A, Tier Justice at 30,000 feet, Anthony Cole." Overnight, his name became a symbol not of wealth or power, but of the quiet dignity of refusing to be erased. Anthony had not chosen the spotlight, but he had chosen what to do with it. The morning after the flight, his team convened in the San Francisco office of Cole Holdings, a sleek space overlooking the bay. Carla, his executive assistant, sat with her laptop open, screens glowing with live feeds of coverage. His legal counsel joined by phone, and senior partners gathered around the long glass table, their faces taut with urgency. Carla broke the silence first. "It's everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, The Times, even international outlets are picking it up. The video has 20 million views already." Anthony leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but unreadable. "Then we don't chase it. We shape it. This isn't just about me. This is about every passenger who has been told, in ways big and small, that they don't belong." His counsel spoke firmly. "We can pursue legal action, defamation, discrimination, breach of contract. The airline will settle to avoid a prolonged scandal." Anthony's gaze sharpened. This can't be about a settlement. Money will not change a system. Policy will. Culture will. Accountability will. He rose from his chair and walked toward the window, the Golden Gate Bridge faint in the distance under a rising sun. His reflection stared back at him, layered over the city skyline. For a brief moment, he thought of Maya, his daughter, scrolling through her phone at school, seeing her father's name explode across headlines. He wanted her to know he had done more than endure. He had turned humiliation into momentum. Calls came in all morning. Reporters clamored for interviews. Civil rights leaders offered support. Even lawmakers reached out, sensing the political weight of the moment. Anthony declined all initial requests. He knew timing mattered. First, he needed the airline to respond. By noon, Global Air's CEO, Elliot Morgan, appeared on television, his face drawn and his words carefully rehearsed. "We are aware of the incident on Flight 762. We deeply regret the distress caused to Mr. Og Cole. Global Air has a long-standing commitment to diversity, inclusion, and customer respect. We are launching a full investigation." Anthony watched the broadcast from his office. He caught the hesitation in Elliot's voice, the vague phrases that sounded more like damage control than reckoning. He switched off the screen and turned to Carla. "Schedule a press conference tonight." When Anthony stepped onto the stage at a San Francisco hotel ballroom hours later, cameras flashed and microphones filled the air with static. He wore a simple dark suit, no flashy pin, no unnecessary gesture, just a man standing in front of a country, ready to listen. His voice was steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of truth. 2 nights ago, I boarded a plane with a valid ticket for seat 1A. What should have been a routine flight turned into a public humiliation. A passenger lied, claiming my seat as her own. The crew chose to believe her. I was threatened with removal. My boarding pass meant nothing until a single officer asked the simplest question, "May I see her ticket?" Only then did the truth emerge. He paused, letting the silence draw the audience closer. This is not about a seat. This is not about one flight. This is about a system that decides who belongs and who does not before facts are even considered. It is about assumptions that carry the weight of law and dignity that can be stripped away in a moment. Flashes lit the room as reporters scribbled furiously. Anthony's eyes scanned the crowd, his voice deepening. "I am not here to ask for an apology. I am here to demand change. Global Air will not walk away from this with platitudes. They will implement independent oversight. They will institute mandatory anti-bias training for every crew member. They will ensure that no passenger is treated as disposable because of who they are. And if they do not, then we will take this to Congress, to the courts, and to the public until justice is not optional, but standard." The applause that followed was not the polite applause of corporate dinners. It was raw, loud, insistent, a sound of people who had seen enough and wanted more. Within days, Global Air announced sweeping reforms. A new Diversity and Equity Council was established, chaired by Anthony himself. Millions were pledged toward training, oversight, and scholarships for underrepresented students in aviation. Employees implicated in the incident were suspended or dismissed. Officer Ramirez was publicly commended, while Officer Miller quietly resigned. The video continued to circulate, sparking debates on talk shows, in offices, in classrooms. Was this an isolated incident or a mirror reflecting a broader truth? People argued, dissected, defended, condemned. But one thing was undeniable. Anthony Cole had forced the conversation into the open. 6 months later, Anthony stood at a national aviation conference in Washington, D.C. Global Air's reforms had already begun to ripple across the industry. Other airlines followed suit, implementing new policies to prevent bias in their cabins. The FAA issued updated guidelines. Lawmakers drafted legislation to ensure accountability. As Anthony walked onto the stage to deliver the keynote, he caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. Ramirez, now promoted to a leadership role in airport security, sat in the front row. The young woman who had recorded the incident, now a journalist with a major outlet, held a notebook in her lap. Even Laura Benson, the flight attendant, was there, not in uniform, but as part of Global Air's new training initiative. She had faced consequences, but she had chosen growth over denial. Anthony's speech was not about the past, but the future. We cannot undo what happened on Flight 762, but we can ensure that what began as humiliation ends as transformation. We can build a system where dignity is not conditional, where the boarding pass is enough, where no one has to plant their feet and prove again and again that they belong. The applause rose once more, filling the hall with the sound of change taking root. Anthony stood tall, his presence steady, his eyes reflecting both resolve and hope. Later that evening, as he walked alone along the reflecting pool, the city lights shimmering on the water, Anthony allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. He thought of Maya, of his father, of every nameless traveler who had been made to feel small. He whispered into the cool air, "We belong, and we always will." The night was quiet, but within that quiet was a promise. The reckoning had begun, and it would not be stopped. And so, from one stolen seat came a reckoning that no airline could ignore. Anthony Cole didn't just win back his place in row one, he forced an entire industry to confront its silent prejudices. What began as humiliation in a narrow cabin aisle became a movement toward accountability, equity, and respect for every passenger. But beyond headlines and policies, this story is about something deeply human. It's about the quiet strength to stand firm when every voice around you says to sit down. It's about the courage to resist humiliation, not with anger, but with dignity so unshakable it exposes truth for all to see. Catherine Wells lost her stolen comfort. The crew lost their blind authority. But the world gained a reminder. Justice is not a favor, it is a right. Anthony's refusal to move became a lesson for us all. Silence sustains injustice, but one voice, one stand, can unravel a system. As you close this chapter with us, carry the question forward the next time you see injustice. Will you stay silent, or will you stand? If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can keep these stories alive, reminding the world that dignity is never negotiable, and justice is always worth the fight.